What is happening, everybody? Week 6 of the NFL season. It is going to be starting at the main slate tomorrow. It's Saturday afternoon. Myself and Neil Orfield, who has won a Millie Maker. Every Saturday, we break down the main slate for Sunday's NFL contest. And then we bring you guys the information on who it is we're targeting in large field tournaments. What chalk do we like? What chalk do we maybe not like? Some contrarian options that maybe we like, as well as our favorite stacks. It's like we cover everything here. If you guys have any questions for us at all, throw them into the YouTube chat. Throw them into Discord if you're a Stochastic member. And also, shout out to Rainmakers, who is sponsoring our show today. If you guys want to check out Rainmakers for NFL football, they have a totally free starters pack that you guys could claim. It is free, and you can win actual cash prizes with it. So take advantage of a free opportunity to make some money. And as you come in, the only thing I really ask of you is to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It helps keep our content free, and we do appreciate it. And it's only going to take a half second of your time. But Neil, what is going on? We've got week 6 of the season, already about a third of the way through the year. It's going pretty quick here. How was week 5 for you? You remember? It seems like forever ago.
It does seem like forever ago. So I know that I did not do extremely well monetarily. I feel like I got some pieces really right. Like you and I talked about how much we loved Dallas Goedert last week. Dallas Goedert went all the way off, so that was fun. But some things like felt really close to being right. Like I was really high on Jalen Waddle last week, scored the touchdown right away. I believe I read that he had the second most expected fantasy points among all wide receivers last week, but he had four targets within the 5-yard line and only converted one of them to a touchdown. So I felt like it was close to being a really good week, but didn't quite get there. And of course, part of the reason that I wanted Jalen Waddle and Raheem Mostert was they were nice leverage off of Devin Achane and Tyreek Hill. And of course, you wanted the Achane and Hill side of that equation. So the plays that were supposed to be leverage did okay, but weren't like actually great leverage because they didn't do as well as their counterparts that were a little bit chalkier. How did you do last week?
Yeah, I've run very well in football this year. So this is through 5 weeks. I've now had 3 weeks where I've had lineups in the top 100 of the Millie Maker, where I've been live to win it. And obviously I have not won a Millie Maker to this point this season, but I keep getting like fairly close. So last week was another profitable week for me. And some of it was definitely due to luck because pretty much everywhere, Breece Hall was not projected for like any ownership last week. And we talked about him on the show, and I was like, this is the cheapest Breece Hall is ever going to be. And there was all the coach speak coming out about how he wasn't getting any restrictions. So I'm like, I'm going to load up on Breece Hall in large field tournaments. And he crushed. It was like, something I felt good about. But if I would have known his actual ownership would have been going into the slate, I would have played a lot less of Breece Hall. Like, I can't remember a time that there was a player who just industry consensus was projected for like sub 10% ownership that ended up being just absolute chalk. So he was the guy that I used to get away from Achane when I didn't play Achane in large field tournaments. And they had almost the exact same fantasy production, but they also ended up being the same ownership, which is not really what I was expecting. But all in all, it ended up being a pretty good slate. And something else that also helped me out a whole bunch. Do you remember last week, Neil? My favorite tournament stack and my favorite lineup for single entry was Jared Goff stacks. And nobody played Jared Goff somehow last week, where we had like Montgomery was chalky, Laporta was chalky, Khalif Raymond was chalky, Josh Reynolds was chalky, and then somehow nobody played Goff. He was like 2-3% owned. So that was something that really differentiated lineups as well.
Yeah, I had I don't think I even realized that Breece Hall actually became chalky. The Lion stack was one that I totally agreed with you. I was like, I totally follow the logic. This makes a lot of sense. And then I don't think I actually played any. Like I was looking at it later. I was like, all right, how much did I get of that stack? And I was like, oh shit, I didn't focus on it. Like I was focused on other spots in terms of giving boosts and getting to more players. So I was with the fish on that one, who were playing all of the pieces of the Lions except for Jared Goff. But yeah, that was a great call last week.
All right, and let's start looking ahead at this week's slate now with the quarterbacks, where we begin to talk about some of the quarterbacks we're building around and then some of the stack options. And one thing we are starting to see is a little bit of smaller slates, right? 11 games on the main slate this week. It was only 10 games last week. That's for a couple of reasons. Number one is that we have teams that are starting on bye weeks now. The other part as well is we've got some of these London games on Sunday mornings, which also takes one game out of the equation, which we also have tomorrow morning. But for this slate, it's one where we don't even have that many of the super expensive quarterbacks, right? Like there's no Patrick Mahomes on the slate. We don't have Josh Allen on the slate, both of them playing in primetime games this week. So with that in mind, my quarterback exposures, I'm getting to Tua for sure, but it is more leaning towards playing quarterbacks like in the mid-range of the pricing. Is that kind of what it looks like it's going to end up being for you as well?
Yeah, most likely. It's sort of interesting because we actually have some positive leverage on the guys who are a little bit more expensive. So I don't think I'm going to go fully to the mid-range. Actually, I don't even know if that will be my primary way of playing. I think that like I don't like really love any of the guys in the high end except for Tua, but I think that I have enough like for these guys that I'm probably gonna end up actually pretty concentrated, I think, on the more expensive plays. Just looking at the top stacks tool, some of our better leverage spots are on Tua. Looks great. We have Tua coming in at 10% ownership, 16% chance of Miami being the top stack. So I think that I'm going to get to some Tua. Kirk Cousins, pretty expensive. We've got him at just 1% ownership, 5% chance of being the top stack. And of course, we've got, all of the cheaper pieces for the Vikings with Justin Jefferson out. The rest of the receivers are too cheap. So that one, it's a sort of expensive stack, but not as expensive as it would be if you were trying to get J Jets in there. So, and then we have, looking at Jalen Hurts in the tools. We have him at 4% projected ownership, 8% chance of being the top stack. Like I don't usually want to target this Jets defense, but if I can play Jalen Hurts at 4% ownership, I kind of feel like that's a spot I'm going to have some interest in. Jared Goff at sub 1% is pretty interesting. So I actually think that I'm probably going to end up, and even so, one player who has massive negative leverage, who was like one of the spots that stood out to me coming in, was Justin Fields. Like, oh, Justin Fields is just on a tear right now, throwing the ball, and then he's also got the rushing upside. But now we actually have him. He doesn't look good in the tools. He's one of those plays that I'm probably going to play some anyway. But looking at the tools, he's coming in 7% ownership, 2% chance of being the top stack. So he doesn't really fit the guys who are pay up to be contrarian, but still somebody that I have some interest in. So I actually think that I'm going to be getting to the high end kind of a lot.
So I have lineups run through our sims for both DraftKings and FanDuel, and my results look very similar to the top stacks tool, whereas there's really only three quarterbacks I'm getting a significant amount of exposure to. If you look at our top stacks tool, it's not difficult to figure out which three they ended up being. It is Matt Stafford, who's in the mid-range. It's Tua, who's more expensive. And then Joe Burrow, who I don't think the pricing has caught up to Joe Burrow at all yet. Like Joe Burrow is $6,300 over on DraftKings. The price point on Joe Burrow over on FanDuel is $7,500. So he's relatively cheap on both sites. Now, is he cheap relative to the entire field of quarterbacks? No, he's priced in the mid-range, but he's cheap relative to historical pricing for Joe Burrow. And for what we saw out of him last week, I think he's healthy again. Because one thing that really, other than just the results of the game and the fact that Jamar Chase went off and had a massive game, here was the thing that really signified to me that Joe Burrow is in a good place. There was a play where he was under pressure. He runs up the middle, he scrambles for 10 yards to get a first down. We've not seen that from him at all this year, where whenever he's faced pressure, it's been a thing where like he either has to throw the ball away or he just kind of has to surrender himself to give up the sack because he just didn't have the mobility to escape any pressure because he was playing with a bum calf. Now he's totally healthy. The pricing hasn't caught up yet. And while he is somewhat popular on the slate, it's not crazy. We have him under-owned on both FanDuel and DraftKings in the top stacks tool. So those three quarterbacks are making up a large bulk of my lineups. Like 3/4 of my lineups are those guys. And then it's kind of like a mishmash of other guys thrown in there. But that's really what I'm building my lineups around. Stafford, Burrow, and Tua, and stacking around those three teams.
Yeah, and I think that those are obviously great stacks as well. Tua, one that I already mentioned, but Burrow, yeah, you're right. Like they were saying that he looked healthy in practice. It sort of felt to me like they were like lying to us. I was like, he looks so bad on Sunday, and you're telling us now, like 3 days later, he looks totally healthy, looks great out there. I was like, I'm not buying it. And then of course in the game, he looked great. And now he gets another great matchup with the Seahawks. So he should be able to throw on the Seahawks. So obviously a great play. And then Stafford, I like both sides of that game. I was a little bit, I don't love that Stafford is getting 16% ownership. I was kind of hoping it was going to be a more contrarian play, but I guess everybody has seen every offense just crush Arizona all year. And at this point, and you got the Rams, of course, looking really high powered, like their passing game with Stafford. Now they've got cutback to add to Puka Nacua. Even Atwell's look good. So it makes sense that it's going to get a lot of ownership. But I'm willing to go there. Even at the 16% ownership, I'm right there with you. 18% chance of the Rams being the top stack. They look great. So I can't argue with those. I think that I'm going to probably be above weight to the field on the expensive guys that I mentioned, but I also think that I'm going to be probably not far off from the field on those two in particular, in Burrow and Stafford.
And then I have one contrarian QB that I like a little bit, but not something I'm going to necessarily go crazy with. I'm overweight to the field on Baker Mayfield right now, which is hard to really feel great about. But with that said, we kind of know where the targets are going in the offense. If Baker Mayfield happens to have a big game, guess what? It's going to be Chris Godwin and Mike Evans who are on the receiving end of that. Mike Evans, I know he is officially listed as questionable, so we're going to need confirmation he's ultimately in. But if he is out, then, I do think Mayfield to Godwin stacks will make some semblance of sense. So, yeah, I'm going to be way more concentrated at quarterback than I typically would be otherwise. So, I'll just reiterate Burrow, Tua, Stafford. If I'm throwing contrarian guy in there, it's going to be Baker Mayfield. Are there any contrarian QBs that are standing out to you for this slate?
Not especially. Like maybe I'll have a share or two of Desmond Ridder just because that Washington pass defense has been so bad. It's not the right offense to take advantage of the Washington pass defense, but I think that if Desmond Ridder is ever going to have a big game passing, it would be against that Washington pass defense. So I might take a couple of shots there on Ridder. I think that I will have a few shots on Josh Dobbs. Like we talked about the Stafford side of it. Dobbs does look really over-owned in our tools is my one concern. We have him at 7% ownership, 2% chance of being optimal, but I'm really interested in the Arizona receivers and Dobbs is relatively cheap. So I think that it just makes sense to, in some lineups where I'm playing Rondell Moore or Marquise Brown or even Michael Wilson, I might consider, makes sense to throw Josh Dobbs in there as just like a cheap stack. So I think that I'll probably have, a share or two there. And then I'm debating whether I might play some Brock Purdy and just throw some McCaffrey into those stacks. But I don't think that I'll get there. I don't think that I'm going super contrarian this week.
Yeah, and by the way, pretty interesting comment in the YouTube chat from All I See Is Gold, who said Stafford hasn't produced enough to be that highly owned. I think Stafford has played very well this year. Here's one thing that's happened, though. There's been a lot of plays where the Rams have just ended up rushing for touchdowns instead of throwing for touchdowns. Yeah. So through 5 games this year, in general, Stafford's been in very difficult matchups. He's been on the road against Seattle. He's played San Francisco. Last week, he played against Philly. He had 2 other road matchups against the Bengals and the Colts, which weren't quite as difficult, but still overall, I'd consider it a fairly difficult strength of schedule for Matt Stafford. He hasn't had his number 1 wide receiver in Cooper Kupp for most of the year. And I think a lot of this is just touchdown variance. Like the things that he could actually control, he's done really well with. And this is a team, too, that, wasn't expected to be all that great this year, considering the strength of schedule they've had. They've been competitive. They're 2-3 so far this year. And yeah, 3 out of 5 games this year, we've seen Stafford throw for north of 300 yards. So it doesn't really concern me too much that he just hasn't had the touchdowns, because that's really all that he's missing to this point in the season. I think he's played much better than expected. And even to a point, too, I kind of wrote off Stafford last year and just like, oh, he's a little washed, a little bit past it. And then you kind of start to watch him play this year. It's like, oh, maybe he was banged up last year. Cooper Kupp wasn't healthy for a lot of last year. He wasn't healthy at the starter this year. I think the Rams offense certainly not as good as they were when they were, one of the best teams in the NFL, but they're definitely somewhere in between what they were last year and what they were 2 years ago. So I think this is still a pretty good spot for Stafford. And he is somebody that I think warrants being the highest owned quarterback on the slate.
Stafford is also 5th in the entire NFL in passing yards on the year, and that includes Patrick Mahomes ahead of him, who already picked up yards on Thursday. Yeah. So really 4th heading into this week. Yeah, Stafford hasn't had the touchdown, but that's largely variance. Just not getting touchdowns is much more variable than yardage, and Stafford's been great from a yards per game standpoint.
Is there anything else you want to add about the quarterbacks for this slate, Neil?
No, I don't want to bring up the name Bryce Young. I bring him up every week. I'm like, once again, he is in a primo spot going up against that bad Miami defense, going to need to be throwing it. I might have a share or two, but it has not worked out at all this year. He doesn't look good so far this year, but I might take a shot or two. That would be the one contrarian piece that I wasn't even going to bring up if you didn't give me another chance, but I might take another shot or two there just and hope that he makes progress as his rookie year goes on.
Yeah, I'm looking through my lineup. So my top 150 on both DraftKings and FanDuel, I have 0 shares of Bryce Young across those 300
That's
lineups.
Probably smart.
Yeah, he isn't making the cut for me. And yeah, this is as concentrated as I've been at quarterback for the entire year. And it's the exact same quarterbacks that I'm getting to on both FanDuel and DraftKings, and relatively similar exposures across those 2 sites as well. So let's go ahead and start looking at the running backs, and a lot of interesting injury situations this week, Neil, where we have no more Achane. So Achane, who was super popular last week, ends up getting there even despite limited carries. Has another game where he goes out and puts up, 13, 14 yards per carry. I forget exactly what the number was. Now he's out. We've got Raheem Mostert. He's in a prime spot. We've got Chuba Hubbard, no Miles Sanders. He's in a prime spot as well. So a couple of guys who are, looking like pretty good options because the starters on their team are not going to be out there. So more workload going to them. When you're looking at your running back exposure this week, With the injuries, do you think your exposure is going to gear more towards the high end, the mid range, or the cheaper end of running backs?
I would guess mid-range to cheaper end. I don't think I'm going to have a ton of the high-end guys. Like, I just don't love the spot for McCaffrey or the price tag. Of course, that bit me a few weeks ago, where it was like he needs to do so well to pay off this price tag, and then he did. So certainly,
Like 52 fantasy points.
yeah, exactly. It was like, man, that hurt. But I think this week I'm willing to risk it again and not play a ton of McCaffrey at the high end. Josh Jacobs, looks good in our tools, but I don't know that I'm going to want to play a ton of Josh Jacobs against the Patriots. They're, still a fine defense. I'll have probably some Josh Jacobs, but it's not like a huge priority for me. So yeah, just looking at it, like, I think that we have enough like good value options to me that I'm probably going more towards the mid to low end in terms of salary.
Yeah, so this is one spot where DraftKings and FanDuel are a little bit different for me because I like Mostert on both sites, but he's an actual pay up option on FanDuel. Like they aggressively priced him. They made Mostert $8,500 on FanDuel after the injury to Achan. And by the way, I still think $8,500 is a playable price point for Mostert in this spot over on FanDuel. But on DraftKings, he's just not a pay up option. He's only $6,400. He's going to be chalk this week, but it's warranted. Matchup against the Carolina Panthers. We've seen the upside Mostert has this year. And now there's no Achane there. Also, Jeff Wilson, it looked like he was somebody who was going to be in the mix. Now it looks like that is no longer going to be the case. So with that kind of situation now, we've got Mostert really standing out to me on both FanDuel and DraftKings. So FanDuel, I do like Mostert as a pay up option. On DraftKings, I'm not really getting to the most expensive running backs. And I know this is kind of a thing where it's like really McCaffrey and everybody else because he's $9,500 and there's nobody remotely close to him. The next closest price tag is David Montgomery. It's $7,300. Not really getting to him. Bijan Robinson, he's $7,200. He's popular. Not really getting to him. We've got ETN at $7,100. Not really getting to him. I do get to some of Josh Jacobs at $7,000. So not the same price tag as McCaffrey, but he is the pay up option. I get to the most of those 7K guys on DraftKings. Is it the same for you? Is there somebody else priced around 7K? Do you prefer to Josh Jacobs?
No, I think it is Josh Jacobs in that like high end range. I think he's probably the running back that I'm going to get to the most of that high end. I still think I'm going to be underweight to the field. Like we have him coming in at 24% ownership. I would guess that I'm going to be under the field there. We actually have positive leverage there, so it's sort of interesting. I'm sort of surprised to see the positive leverage we have there, but he is very involved. 24% ownership. We've got him optimal 25% of the time. I would guess that I'm still going to be heavier on the cheaper guys and a little bit underweight to Josh Jacobs, but yeah, it looks like that's a mistake according to the Boom Bust tool.
Yeah, and then looking through the other guys around here, like I don't really get all that much exposure until we start to go into that 6K range where we get, the Kyron Williams, Raheem Mostert, Joe Mixon type guys. If I go ahead and look at my lineups over on FanDuel, did mention that for Mostert, a little bit different there because he's priced at $8,500. So I do like him as a pay up option. And then once you start to get, a little bit cheaper, Josh Jacobs, he's priced around 8K. Kyron Williams, I think those guys are acceptable. But once again, more expensive on FanDuel than they are on DraftKings. And I do get less of Kyron Williams, Josh Jacobs on FanDuel than I do on DK. In the mid-range of the pricing here at running back, Neil, this is where we have Mostert, we have Mixon, we have Kyron Williams. This is really the sweet spot for me. This is the running backs that I'm really getting the most exposure to. Do one of these guys stand out more than the others between Mostert, Kyron Williams, Joe Mixon? Do you have a favorite amongst these options, or is it somebody else in this range that you prefer?
Yeah, it's Mostert for me. I'm shocked to see that we have positive leverage on Mixon. I'm like, that seems way too high owned for Mixon in this matchup. Like the Seahawks, not a great defense, but they're better against the run than against the pass. Mixon couldn't even get it done against the Cardinals. So I'm like, I would want to play Mixon at low ownership here, but at 23% ownership, I would guess I'm going to come in underweight to the field. It's funny because I'm saying the opposite of what the Boom Bust tool is telling me, which is not usually my MO. I'm usually pretty tools oriented, but here, just like Mostert against Carolina makes all the sense in the world to me. Like this is an offense that has a 31 implied team total, going up against the worst rush defense in the league so far. And Mostert, now we've got Achane out. Mostert already heavily involved, now going to be even more involved. So it's like everything to me screams like this is just like the best spot you could possibly hope for Raheem Mostert. So he would be the one that I want to play the most from that range. He is the one that I'm probably going to be above weight to the field, even though we have him at 17% ownership 14% chance to be an optimal. I don't love seeing that. It scares me a little bit, but I still think Mostert for me is just the one that stands out as the player who makes the most sense to me. I don't think I'm going to get to a ton of Mixon. Kyron Williams, I do like that as well. I really love that game environment. I'm going to be playing kind of all sides of that game, I think. Kyron Williams, I don't think he's a particularly good running back, but he's still like, he is their running back. He's the guy they're going to be using if they're running the ball. So I think that probably my ranking there would be Mostert 1, Kyron Williams 2, Joe Mixon 3 for me of those 3. How about you? How are you playing it?
It is, in terms of my exposures right now, it is Mostert 1, Mixon 2, Kyron Williams 3. But with that said, I view Mostert on a tier of his own, right? He really stands out to me more than these other guys. Another thing too is if you look at our ownership projections, we have so many guys that are projected for similar ownership on DraftKings at running back, where if I sort by ownership here, we have Mostert 26% owned, Jacobs 22%, Kyron Williams 21, Mixon 21, ETN 17, Kamara 17, Chuba Hubbard 17, Montgomery 16. Then you've got Bijan Robinson at 15. And then there's like a pretty big drop off at running back exposure. But there's these group of guys who are really going to be popular. And then kind of not a whole lot else that the field is getting to. So with that in mind, is there anybody that's contrarian that you like in the mid-range at running back? And if not, that's also okay.
Yeah, let me sort by salary real quick. Yeah, I don't think I'm doing the Zach Moss thing. Of course, got that one wrong last week. I was like, nobody could possibly play Zach Moss this week. And then he put up a ridiculous game last week against Tennessee somehow, but I'm still not going there. I don't think maybe some Kenneth Walker. That's kind of interesting. Like he's going a little bit low owned in a game environment that people are going to want to play some there. I think I can see myself getting to some sub 5% owned Kenneth Walker against the Bengals. That's kind of interesting to me. So maybe I'll throw some Kenneth Walker out there. You can always play DeAndre Swift, but I don't think I'm going to get there a ton. He's, it is one of the spots where it's like he's behind maybe the best offensive line in the league, and he's only getting, well, I guess he's getting 12% ownership. So probably not going to get to a ton there. I'll be at least underweight to the field on DeAndre Swift. Yeah, honestly, I don't see anybody else that I'm super interested in the like 6 to 7K range. But if I play anybody above the field of the contrarian guys, it would probably be Kenneth Walker.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely does make some sense, especially considering that if I'm looking at my lineups right now, Joe Burrow is one of the quarterbacks who I'm kind of, building around. I've only got 3 quarterbacks that I've got a decent amount of exposure to. With that in mind, you start to look at the Seattle side of the game and you try to figure out who are my run backs going to be in some of those lineups where I do have a player from the other side for a game stack. And I'm not really in love with Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf this week. And I think kind of by default, I'm going to end up landing on Kenneth Walker when I'm actually, confirming my lineups and setting in the final version of them. So I'm on the same page as you. I think that he's a little bit underowned and he just makes sense in terms of the overall construction of what my lineups are going to look like, my game stacks, my quarterback exposures.
One bonus point that I just want to make, I hadn't even looked at this prior. Bengals are 30th in rush DVOA versus 12th in pass DVOA. I didn't even realize that the Bengals defense is such a run funnel. So just one more bonus point for playing Kenneth Walker here.
Yeah. And another thing too with Walker is they're still really, the Seahawks, how they utilize the running backs is always kind of weird. We see this all the time where they'll draft a running back in like the second or third round. But it was Kenneth Walker not all that long ago. They use a high draft pick on a running back and you think like, oh, that's going to be bad news for the starting running back's workload. And then it just doesn't end up mattering until if it plays out like every other running back, whether it be Chris Carson or whoever else the Seahawks have, is eventually they'll just move on from Kenneth Walker. Charbonnet will become the guy. But at least as of right now, it is still Kenneth Walker as the go-to guy for the Seahawks. And we haven't really seen Charbonnet cut into his production at all. Anything else you really want to mention from the mid-range at running back, Neil?
Nope.
All right, so let's go ahead and look at value options at running back. And here's where we really have to talk about Chuba Hubbard, because there's no Miles Sanders for this team. Hubbard has been not great this year from an efficiency standpoint. He's very involved in the passing game, though, which is what I like about him this week, because this game script really sets up for a lot of throwing in the later stages of the game. And when we've seen Hubbard in those like 2-minute drill type situations or the Panthers trailing and he gets on the field, he gets targeted. One that stands out the most to me was that drive against the Saints week 2 of the season, where I remember I got really excited about Hubbard in my best ball teams because I was like, oh, cool. They're just going to use him. The Panthers are going to be terrible. And they're just going to use him in these scenarios and get targets all the time. And so he had a 2-minute drive where he was on the field for basically like all of it, ends up catching 5 passes for 30 yards or something like that on one individual drive. And I think that's how a lot of this game could end up going for him with Miles Sanders out. Not really a whole lot else to like in the backfield for the Panthers. What are you doing with Chuba Hubbard, who I thought was going to end up being really chalky, and I'm kind of surprised he isn't.
Yeah, if the ownership stays where it is right now, I'm going to have just a ton of Chuba Hubbard. He is one of my favorite plays on the entire slate. I think he makes a ton of sense here. And Miami, yeah, they're a great team, but their defense is not great. Just their offense is so good. Their offense overpowers people. But 4,300 Chuba Hubbard doesn't make any sense to me. Part of me thinks that is like going to come up significantly by tomorrow. But if it stays anywhere like sub 10%, I'm going to be over the field on Chuba Hubbard. I think that you can't ask for a better spot. Obviously they will be likely playing from behind, which typically you don't love that for your running backs, but you just laid out the reasons that maybe that's not a concern. When you're 4,300, you pick up 5 PPR points like that gets you halfway to where you need to be just about. So yeah, I think Chuba Hubbard looks great against Miami. 4,300 should be the primary back there. I'm totally in on Chuba Hubbard at this. We currently have him at sub 2% ownership. My guess is that comes up, but if it stays below 10%, I can say I'm going to be well over the field there.
You might want to refresh because we have him projected for 17% ownership on DraftKings. And then on FanDuel, he is projected for 15% ownership. So he's not like crazy contrarian or anything, but he's lower on than I thought. Like I thought he was going to be like the A-Chan of last week. We're just considering the price point, 4,300 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. I thought this would be one of those guys who's going to be like 30% owned, but that's not what the projections are showing right now. This is the cheapest running back that I've really liked as a value play this year, Neil. I can't remember anybody I was getting to that I really liked from this cheap of a price point. Is there anybody else you could remember over the course of the year that we've been playing at this low of a salary?
Anybody who'd been playing at this low of a salary who was
at running back?
I do remember, man, who was that Falcons running back a couple years back? Mike Davis.
No. This year.
Oh, this year. No, I don't think we've played any like super chalky, super chalky low salary running backs that I can think of. Like I played some like Tyler Algier at last week. I played a little bit, but no, I don't think we've had any great like super cheap running backs this year. This is kind of new.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's popped up in other seasons, but it's one thing also because the min price of running back used to be $3K. DraftKings has raised that, so we do see backups priced a little bit more aggressively just to prevent some of those scenarios where you get these guys who just become, 40, 50% owned in the milli maker. So we don't quite get that. But I think Hubbard could really be the guy who people might look back and be like, oh, why was he not more popular? Not because he's any good, not because the Panthers are good, not because I expect them to win, but just because I think he's going to be on the field a lot. He's going to be on the field in passing scenarios. And this could be a game that might look like, remember Kamara's first game back a couple of weeks ago where it was like, the team sucked. He wasn't efficient, but he was targeted like 15 times. He had 13 catches for 30 yards. Hubbard could have a game like that where it's like, hey, he had, 10 catches for 40 yards at the end of the game and just crushes from a PPR perspective while not scoring or being particularly efficient. That's kind of what I envision this game going for him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I'm just requesting that we update our ownership in the boom bust tool so I can see it all in the same place. But yeah, that's obviously 17% ownership. Pretty different for Chuba Hubbard. I still imagine I'm going to be above weight to the field there, though.
And then as far as other cheap running backs, what do you make of the situation that we have with D'Onta Foreman? Because all of a sudden yesterday, the Bears ruled out everybody at running back. Like everybody. And Foreman, prior to being on the Bears, he was a guy who was on the Panthers in a scenario where he was a pretty viable DFS running back last year at times. He's another running back, super cheap. He is $4,400 on DraftKings. Over on FanDuel, Foreman is $6,000. I don't like him nearly as much as Chuba Hubbard, but do you view him as a viable pivot off of Hubbard in tournaments?
Definitely. Against this Vikings run defense, especially, like I think it's a great spot for D'Onta Foreman. As you said, like in past years, when he has had opportunities, he's actually done really well as a starter. So there's no reason to believe that he can't do it here. Obviously, like going to be a little bit rusty coming in, like hasn't really played this year at all. But the Vikings, not a great defense overall. They're, I guess 14th in terms of run DVOA. So not like the worst in the league, but they're not a great defense overall. And D'Onta Foreman, I think, is just too cheap for his role. Like, I think he should be, the bell cow here for the Bears. That's what I'm expecting at the very least. So I do have a lot of interest in Deontay Foreman. I agree with you, not quite on the same level as Chuba Hubbard, but like it's a good spot. It's as good of a spot as he can hope for to come in. So yeah, I like it quite a bit.
Foreman is projected for 9% ownership over on FanDuel, and on DraftKings, we Foreman projected for 11% ownership. So you're getting him at, slight like 50% salary, or sorry, like a 30% ownership discount versus what is going on with Chuba Hubbard. Anything else you want to talk about as far as the running backs go?
Yeah, I mean, I got to throw it in that same game. Alexander Madison at 5,600. Like he's been really bad this year, but so far still has the split in his favor over Cam Akers. And he's as I said, 5,600 now. No Justin Jefferson. Kind of wonder if the Vikings might run more. Like I am interested in playing stacks of the passing game for the Vikings against that Bears defense, but I do think like you can make a case for maybe they just want to run the ball now that they don't have Justin Jefferson. Maybe that they're going to focus a little bit more on the run. So I have some interest in Madison at 5,600. I don't know what I'm doing with the Arizona running game. I'm more interested in the passing game here. DeMarcado we do have at 4,900, so he's not like a slam dunk play for me, but somebody that I would consider at low ownership. Amari DeMarcado for the Cardinals. They also actually Keontae Ingram is back and listed as a starter, so take that for what it's worth. It's just kind of a messy situation where like one of these guys could break out and be great. Ingram is the one that we actually have as too low owned. Are you playing either of these guys at all?
As of now, no, but that could change if we get more information, because my expectation right now is it's going to be number one. Like I know that the Cardinals have overperformed expectations to this point. I think it's going to be worse for their offense going forward. And then also in the backfield, it's really hard for me to say like DeMarcado is going to be when he came on the field last week and I saw him already like just picking up big gains that like I had no clue who this guy was.
Yeah.
And those to me could be some of the most dicey NFL scenarios where it's like somebody who like came into the year as like the fourth running back on the depth chart. He gets opportunities because of injuries and because of a blowout scenario. Now we've got somebody who's ahead of him in the depth chart earlier in the year coming back from an injury in Ingram. Like it could be Ingram starts. It could be a split where like each of them gets 7 or 8 touches. And then there's some other guy in the mix that also gets a couple of touches. So unless we get like a real definitive report on what the running back situation is going to look like, or we hear like, hey, Ingram's going to be limited, DeMarcado is going to be the guy, I'd rather just go elsewhere because running back is really loaded this weekend.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty. I think I might take some shots. Probably for me, it would be Ingram if I take shots on one of these guys, just because it is a good spot. Rams 25th against the run. Cardinals maybe keep it on the ground to try to slow down the game a little bit. So I might take some shots there, but I definitely it is a mess. Not a spot that I can say with any confidence who is going to be the guy or that anybody's going to be the guy for this Cardinals team. So it makes some sense to not go there. I think I'll take a few shots because of the spot, but yeah, not high confidence.
If it was a different slate, I might have. The problem is it's not only do you have to, here are the things you need to go correct in order for the Cardinals running back situation playing it to work out. You have to guess which is going to be the guy between Ingram and DeMarcado, which seems very difficult to do. Then you actually need them to produce well, which is another issue within itself. And then we've got all this like good chalk that I view at running back, and you need these guys to outperform them as well. Like you're going to need them to do better than Mostert. You're going to need them to do better than Chuba Hubbard. They're going to have to do better than, even somebody like Deontay Foreman. So there's just all these hurdles that I see them having to overcome in order to make optimal line. It just makes it something that I don't want to take my chances on. If one of them ends up going out and scoring, like 20 fantasy points, even that might not kill me looking at all the other running backs on the slate. Sure. So I'm going to be going elsewhere at running back. Here's one contrarian option I do like. Breece Hall. I'm also, there's a part of me who wonders like, oh, well, he was expected to be contrarian last week and then he ended up being massively popular. So maybe he does end up being more owned than the 5% ownership he's projected for. But some of the same sort of stuff I talked about last week, Neil, which is Breece Hall is one of the most dynamic and best running backs that we have in the NFL. And at the start of the year, he was just coming back from an ACL injury. They're kind of working him. And last week we saw the restrictions lifted. And he crushed. He looked really good. He was also in a great matchup against the Denver Broncos. This week, he's slightly more expensive. He has a harder matchup, infinitely harder matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. But there's still a part of me that looks at the pricing and goes, this isn't the right salary for Breece Hall. Like when is there going to be a time that Breece Hall is going to be 6K again going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's a little bit too cheap. Like it's a tough spot against that Eagles defense, but they are a little bit banged up. So maybe this is a chance that he can take advantage of the banged up Eagles defense. Not somebody that I have been planning on playing, but yeah, I get it. That makes some sense. I kind of skipped over as we were talking about the 6K range. We didn't. I forgot that Alvin Kamara is playing against the Texans. I was like, yeah, I don't love Alvin Kamara. He's going to be a little bit too high owned here, but I can't just skip over talking about him because he is in one of the best spots you can possibly hope for. He actually got 22 carries last week. I was focused on Kendra Miller taking on more of a role, having 12 carries himself, but Kamara also did have 22 carries last week. So if you're getting that much involvement and playing against that Texans run defense, got to at least throw him out there. I don't think that I'll get up to where the field is with Kamara, but I was thinking like maybe I'll just skip over him completely, but seeing I'd forgotten that he's playing the Texans, and yeah, I'll probably have to play some shares of Kamara there.
Yeah, and guys, don't forget, if you're playing large field tournaments this week, go use the stochastic avatar. If you're playing on FanDuel, DraftKings, if you have the stochastic avatar as your picture over on whatever site it is you play on, if you end up winning one of those tournaments or finishing towards the top and you tweet at us, that's stochastic HOF on Twitter, you go and you have yourself a good weekend, you get yourself 1 free month of our football package. So everything included, like our Sims tool, contest generator, player projections, ownership projections, the boom bust tool that Neil likes to reference while we're on shows. And it's a really good way if you guys are hand building lineups and trying to find a couple of options that you like that might be low owned. You get access to all of that. And the easiest way to get it and the cheapest way is just playing with the stochastic avatar on DraftKings and FanDuel, and you win a tournament. Tweet us at stochastic HOF over on Twitter. All right, let's go ahead and start looking at the wide receivers. And wide receiver is much more spread out for me, Neil, than some of the other positions that we've talked about so far, because there are so many good options at wide receiver. And there's not like one chalk play I look at and think is like considerably better than the other ones. Like it's not something like, running back or quarterback where there's like a few guys I feel really good about. But at wide receiver, what are you doing at the high end?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to not want to play some Jamar Chase with Joe Burrow seemingly healthy going up against Seattle. I would imagine I'm going to get to some Jamar Chase there on the high end. We've talked about the Rams. Like I'm really targeting that game. I think that I'll have a mix of Kupp and Nakua in my lineups. Like I don't think I'm taking any huge stand on one versus the other. I think both are going to be very involved. I think week to week, both have a real shot at putting up a big score. So I think, a lot of interest in, just a lot of interest in the high end in general, to be honest. Like I'm looking at it, probably going to have, a good amount of Tyreek Hill. I said that I'm going to be playing a lot of Tua. I'll be playing Tyreek Hill in a good number of those lineups. I am going back to Jalen Waddle, who is one of the contrarian kind of pay up options coming in at just 2% ownership. I'm going to keep going back there until it hits. If it never hits this year, I'm going to lose a lot of money playing Jalen Waddle, because you got to think with this offense at some point, a guy as talented as Waddle should pay off. But it's really hard for me to find anybody that I don't really like in the high end. I kind of have interest in everybody from Jalen Waddle. Maybe even Mike Evans. It's really hard for me to find a guy that I don't like in the high end of wide receiver. All of these guys have a great case to be made for putting up a big score here. Do you have anybody that you're just not playing who's pretty expensive?
Yeah, I am going to be underweight to the field on Puka Nacua, who's still projected to be picking up ownership this week. And, it was somewhat clear last week that there is enough targets for Nacua and Cooper Kupp to coexist. And I am getting to a lot of Stafford. I just strongly prefer Cooper Kupp to Nacua. It would be different if it was a scenario where, like Nacua was projected for like way less ownership than Cooper Kupp, but just not the case. We've still got Nacua coming in at around 10% ownership, only 16% to Cooper Kupp. At that kind of narrow margin between the two of them, I strongly prefer Cooper Kupp, who I think is going to be the better fantasy option going forward. And, you look at what happened at the start of the year with Nacua, a lot of that was because Cooper Kupp was out, obviously. And now Nacua is $8,000 over on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's $7,900, and he still remains like close to as popular as he's been the entire season. So with that in mind, I'm going to be underweight to the field on Nacua if he continues to pick up ownership.
Interesting. So it's such a hard spot to read, but just pulling up the numbers from last week, like he was still like had a huge target share, huge air yard share. Like he was still really involved for the Rams. So I do think like it is reasonable to assume that the guy who has been maybe one of the best receivers in the league for a number of years now, like he's probably still the wide receiver one, but I'm still going to have interest in Nakua. Ran 93% of routes last week. He still had 11 targets with Cooper Kupp back. Kupp had 12 himself. So like Kupp was still getting the most targets, but 40% air yard share for Puka Nakua, like all of these numbers, like he really didn't take a huge step back last week with Cooper Kupp returning. So maybe you can, look forward and assume that Cooper Kupp at some point, they're not going to be able to sustain two guys. And I would expect it to be Kupp who wins out if they, get to a point where they can't really support two wide receiver ones. But I think Puka will have his weeks. You're right. He's not getting like the 3% ownership that I would absolutely love, but I still think at 8% ownership or whatever it is, that's still a reasonable number to me on Puka Nakua. He's at 13% ownership, so he is a little bit high owned, I guess. Maybe I'll be slightly underweight there, but I still think I'm gonna have some interest. He'll probably be involved because I do like stacking that game a good amount though.
Yeah, so he's somebody who, at least relative to the other options on the high end, I like him the least on both FanDuel and DraftKings. My favorite, it's two guys who I'm getting the most exposure to on the high end. It's Cooper Kupp, it's Jamar Chase. Both of them correlate with the quarterbacks I'm stacking. And I mean, Tyreek Hill does to an extent as well. But I'm getting to a little bit more of Chase and Kupp, and then Tyreek Hill will have exposure to him. I also have some Waddle in the picture as well for me. So I have less exposure to Tyreek Hill than I do to Jamar Chase and Cooper Kupp. And as of right now, about even on Chase and Kupp, each of them in close to 30% of my lineups. If T. Higgins is ruled out again, which at least as of right now, when you and I are doing the show, he's listed as questionable to play. If Higgins ends up getting ruled out, it's just going to be another spot where Joe Burrow is going to have to hone in on Jamar Chase. So in that kind of scenario, I would expect I end up getting to a few more Jamar Chase lineups, maybe a few less lineups of Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp, and then Chase would end up being my number one overall pay up wide receiver. So some of it hinges on T. Higgins, but I'm going to be playing a bunch of Jamar Chase either way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think he would be kind of a slam dunk without T. Higgins in there, but I guess I'm thinking that T. Higgins is likelier to play than not, even though he's questionable. But yeah, we don't know for sure T. Higgins' status. That'll affect some things for sure. I think Devontae Adams might be the one that I come in underweight to the field of the expensive guys. I don't love the matchup quite as much, but it's really hard for me, especially after he had a rough outing in the last primetime game. Part of me is like, he's going to be the squeaky wheel, getting all the targets this week if he's healthy enough to. So it's hard for me to full fade him, but I do think that I'll probably be underweight to Devontae Adams.
As far as these pay up options, I'm number one, Jamar Chase, 2, Cooper Kupp, 3, Tyreek Hill, 4, Devontae Adams, 5, Puka Nakua. Underweights the field on both Adams and Nakua for me. As far as the mid-range goes at wide receiver, so if we're looking at everybody who's priced below 8K to say, let's go 6,500 and higher to 7,900. Is there anybody who really stands out to you in that range of pricing, Neil?
Yeah, as far as people I want, Jalen Waddle, as I said, I'm going to be just jamming 2% projected ownership for Jalen Waddle. I should actually double check if that is the same in the ownership tool. So where do we have Jalen Waddle?
Yeah, Waddle is $7,600. He's only projected for 2% ownership. So I do view him as a pretty good pivot off of Tyreek Hill from a standpoint of, like who's the safer play, who projects better points per dollar? The answer is Tyreek Hill. But Tyreek Hill is 10x the ownership of Jalen Waddle. I don't think he outscores them 10-1 in terms of what the ownership projection is. So I'm not getting to like a ton of Waddle, but he is somebody who's pretty easy to be overweight to the field to when he's only 2% owned.
Yeah, I think Waddle is somebody that I am going to force in once again, even though it didn't really hit last week. Like it did seem like they were trying to get him the ball. Once again, they're in a spot where they should be able to do whatever they want here. So I'm really interested in Waddle. I think he's going to be probably my biggest stand on the slate as far as like being over the field. I think Waddle might end up being that guy for me. So love him in this range. I'll have probably some Metcalf just because I'm going to be stacking up that game, but it's not somebody that I'm taking a huge stand on. We have Devontae Smith at 0.3% ownership. At that level of ownership, like, yeah, I'm more interested than 0.3% for Devontae Smith. Jalen Hurts, one of our highest positive leverage quarterbacks on the slate. So if I can play Hurts with Devontae Smith, I think that stack is going to be really low owned and look really good. We also have Brown at 4%. So I think both of those guys are really interesting just because they're getting virtually no ownership. Now they are playing against the Jets and Sauce Gardner, not the best spot in the world, but anytime you get this Eagles offense at this low ownership, I'm probably going to be mixing and matching Brown and Smith in there with some Hurts lineups. Man, DJ Moore, like, do we really think DJ Moore's coming in at sub 2% ownership? I feel like that's got to come up by tomorrow against this Vikings defense. After what he did last time out, like, people are going to remember that. The ownership's probably going to come up, but at sub 2%, like, I'd go back to DJ Moore all day against that Vikings defense. 6,500.
Last 2 games for DJ Moore, if you combine his stats from the last 2 games, 16 catches, 361 yards, 4 touchdowns. It's one of these things also where it's very hard to algorithmically look at a player and project their ownership when there's going to be a good amount of recency bias that could impact what the field is going to do with them. But I agree with you. Whenever you see a guy who it's like slow start to the year for DJ Moore, then really comes on as a couple of massive games in a row, one of them being in a primetime game also, there are things like that impact ownership that's very hard to put an actual numerical value on. But even like DJ Moore having that game on a primetime game as opposed to a Sunday afternoon game where more people were watching, even that is going to get him into a few more lineups. So I do think he's going to come in a little bit higher on what his ownership projection is for that reason.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly how much of a bump to give his ownership, but like, there's no way he comes in sub 2%. That would shock me if he comes in sub 2% after everybody saw him crush against the Commanders. So yeah, but still, like, even if he's at 6-7%, I think DJ Moore is going to be a pretty good play. So I'll have some interest there. Yeah, Pittman looks fine. Gardner makes it throwing the ball.
For me, and we'll need a little bit more information. All reports indicate that Mike Evans is going to be good to go on Sunday.
I think he was taken off the injury report, I think.
Yeah, I think he might still officially be listed as questionable, but neither here nor there. They say that he's going to be good to go for the game. He practiced in full towards the tail end of the week. He's sneakily had a really good fantasy season, has built up a pretty good rapport with Baker Mayfield. So last week, only 3 catches for 40 yards, but keep in mind, he got banged up the last time we saw Mike Evans play. Games before that, 10 targets, 60 yards and a touchdown, 8 targets, 171 yards and a touchdown, 10 targets, 66 yards and a touchdown. So he's also been a frequent red zone target for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which, is a big wide receiver. That's always been the case where he's been a premier red zone target. Mike Evans picking up single-digit ownership in my lineups where I am going to be playing Baker Mayfield as a contrarian quarterback. I do like getting to Mike Evans as a contrarian wide receiver to combine him with as well. So $7,100 for Mike Evans over on DraftKings. I like that as somebody to get to. And then same deal over on FanDuel. He's a little more expensive at $7,600, but I am still a little bit overweight to Mike Evans there. So Mike Evans, a player that I do like getting to some extent there as well. As we start to get into the cheaper wide receivers, Neil, if we're looking, below the 6K range, is there anything that's standing out to you about wide receivers that are priced below 6K?
I'm just going to have to keep taking my L on Adam Thielen, I think. Like, he gets all of the first read targets there in Carolina. They just, for whatever reason, Bryce Young thinks that Adam Thielen is that dude. And maybe he is relative to the rest of the receivers there. But 5,900 in a spot where, again, they're probably going to need to be chucking it to try to keep up with Miami. Even at 5,900, I think Adam Thielen is going to be sort of interesting. Like, just given his involvement in this offense, it pains me to say it. It's crushing my soul. But Adam Thielen, I think, is a good play in DFS once again. So I'd start there. Jordan Addison, 5,700, now stepping into a bigger role with Justin Jefferson out. Like, he's not stepping into the Jefferson role, but you have to imagine he's going to get a higher target share with no Justin Jefferson in there. Jordan Addison, 57, too cheap against this Bears defense. Now he is getting ownership. We've got him projected for 11% ownership. So not like it's a contrarian play, but somebody that I have some interest in. I'll be going to, as I said, I'm going to that Cardinals Rams game a lot. Marquise Brown will be in there for me, 5,300, maybe even Tutu Atwell at 5,100 as a contrarian piece at sub 2% ownership. Like, he might still get some looks there. He's still out on the field plenty. Like, I think that his target share, you can't expect much from him, but you never know. And this is a spot where, they can probably get a lot of people involved. So 5,100 Tutu Atwell might even be sort of in play for me. This is a rare spot. I don't usually love playing Drake London, but I think that this is a spot against this Commanders defense where 4,800 Drake London makes some sense at sub 6% ownership. I think I'll go there a bit. KJ Osborne should step into a bigger role again with Jefferson out, another receiver that they say is going to step into, a lot of the routes that Jefferson was running. KJ Osborne apparently is the guy who's going to be running those routes, and he's 4,400 against the Bears. I have interest there. And then I've said before, like I do have interest for varying reasons in all of these Arizona wide receivers, like Michael Wilson just being their one big guy they can throw it up to. He's 3,800 against this Rams defense, I think makes sense. And then I've sort of been speculating that maybe we see Rondale Moore be a little bit more involved in the running game this week with now that they're without their actual like great running back in James Conner. Now they're having to choose between guys like DeMarcado and Keontae Ingram. Well, they've got Rondale Moore, who has said that he's willing to play running back. He's had success running from the backfield for the Cardinals. And I think even like regardless of whether he actually gets running back looks, I think this is a game where they might be needed to throw it short a good amount. And Rondale Moore really just could pick up a ton of PPR points. So I have interest in all three of the Cardinals wide receivers.
Okay. Yeah. And then, I mean, also, if you just look at some of the lineups that we've talked about building, if we're going to be stacking up the Rams, you're going to at some point want some of the Cardinals as run backs in those lineups. I don't feel great about the running back, so I do think it makes sense to mix in, Michael Wilson, Rondale Moore, Hollywood Brown here and there. And then also Michael Wilson, take this for what it's worth, but there was a press conference the other day where Joshua Dobbs had said that his, paraphrasing here, but his biggest regret from last week was that he only threw the ball twice to Michael Wilson, and it didn't come until the later stages of the game. And he said the first thing he did after the game ended was he texted Michael Wilson and let him know that it's unacceptable for him to only be targeted two times in a game.
I did not hear that. That's awesome.
And and he said that he's going to prioritize getting Michael Wilson more targets this game. So just based on that, I know it's very narrative driven, but it still is something that makes me want to, when I'm building my lineups and putting everything through the sim, to just do like an ROI boost up to Michael Wilson so I get a little bit more exposure to him, because it would seem weird to me if he went out, put out that clip, said that he texted Michael Wilson to tell him he was going to get him more targets, and they just like didn't throw the ball to him this week.
Yeah, and it's a great spot to do so. I had not heard that press conference, but yeah, that's just one more reason to go there. I like it.
And then if I look at my wide receivers, a lot of stuff you said there, I agree with. Christian Kirk, and part of this, I don't want to make it seem like it's a bias on my part, but I've been much lower on Calvin Ridley than most people so far this year, even dating back to the shows that we've done at the beginning of the year, Neil, where we had, like Calvin Ridley. Now in hindsight, it seems crazy that Calvin Ridley was like priced the same as Tyreek Hill in week 2 and was more popular than him.
Yeah.
And when you go back and think about that, and now you look at the overall targets for the year, Calvin Ridley has not been the number one wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's been Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk has 43 targets. Calvin Ridley is 36. Even Evan Ingram has a little bit more target share than Ridley this year, 37 to 36. It's not like it's a massive gap, but the pricing, there is a difference in terms of the pricing between these players. And I do view Christian Kirk right now as the number one wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's not really priced like it. So he's a mid-range wide receiver that I do like. And then on the cheap end, I'm getting to some exposure to Devontae Parker, and that's really just a price point thing. Hard to feel great about it, but it is a thing where he's showing up in lineups. He's only $3,500, and he is an individual play where if he ends up getting targets, which he should, because the Patriots are always losing in every single game, and we have seen him get 19 targets through 4 games so far this year. So enough targets for Devontae Parker to at least be a viable option for me at a very cheap price point. Anything else that you like for a wide receiver this weekend?
So one player that I was getting when I did my lineup generator run this morning, I was getting to a good amount of Rashid Shaheed, which surprised me a little bit. But 3,700 playing against that Houston defense, 3% ownership. I think he makes some sense as a contrarian play that honestly I would not have really thought of until I ran the lineup generator and I was getting him in some lineup. So I think that he is a viable play. But yeah, I don't think that there's anybody else that's immediately standing out to me as plays that I am going to be playing a ton of. I think Christian Kirk, that was a good call out. I agree with you there. But I think that we've largely covered the players I'm most interested in.
All right, so let's talk about the shitty tight end position this week, which I know that it's frequently shitty. It's hard to fill the tight end spot, but like we don't get Travis Kelce on the main slate this week. That's something that's definitely making the position a little harder to feel. We don't have Mark Andrews at the position this week. So tight end, it sucks. And one thing that really stands out too is if you look at the pricing, pull it up on DraftKings right here. The drop off there is from TJ Hawkinson to everybody else, it's massive. TJ Hawkinson is $6,600. Then you got Laporta, $5,600. Laporta was listed questionable on the injury report, but he's good to go now. He's going to play. And then you got George Kittle at $5,000. If you have the price to pay up for a tight end, it's TJ Hawkinson by such a wide margin for me. And Jordan Addison, I'm going to be getting exposure to him as well in the absence of Justin Jefferson. But if I'm only picking one of the pass catchers for the Vikings without Justin Jefferson being in the mix, I lean towards Hawkinson over Addison just because of how hard the tight end position is to fill and the opportunity I think Hawkinson is going to be having this weekend. So TJ Hawkinson is my favorite overall tight end on this slate. The other tight ends I'm getting to, it's generally who stacks with my quarterback, who's a run back in other lineups. So like I get some exposure to Zach Ertz, not because I love Zach Ertz, but if I'm stacking the Rams, like just kind of by default, I have Ertz as the run back in some of those lineups. So Neil, do you like TJ Hawkinson as a pay up, or is there somebody else that you envision being your most roster tight end of the weekend?
I mean, you know that I like TJ Hawkinson as a pay up. He's on my Vikings. Now, like all of these guys, I think like we don't really know exactly how the target share is going to break down now without Justin Jefferson, but would not be shocking at all to see TJ Hawkinson just get back into, getting double digit targets every single game. Nice spot against the Bears. So yeah, I'm really in for TJ Hawkinson. I'll be playing a ton this week, and we've only got him at 9% ownership right now. Like that's too low ownership for a guy who should be targeted pretty heavily in a good spot here. So yeah, I'm definitely in on TJ Hawkinson this week. I feel like outside of Hawkinson, I'm largely going to be paying down. Like I don't know that I'm going to have a ton of Sam Laporta. I might, maybe I'll get up to where the field is at 6.5%, but not taking a huge stand there. Kittle's interesting at 1%, but like it's not a great spot for Kittle. Goddard similarly, like great for us last week when we were playing a ton of Goddard. I don't know that I do know that I don't feel the same way this week. Like he's not going to be somebody that I'm like really going out of my way to play. I might have him in some of those hurt stacks that I've been referencing, but I don't think that I'm going to be playing a ton of Goddard independently. I have some interest in Cole Kmet in that I like the game environment for Vikings Bears, and I think that he could be a low owned part of that game environment. 4% projected ownership for Cole Kmet. He tends to do well when Justin Fields does well, so I don't hate playing some Cole Kmet. Evan Ingram looks a little bit chalky, but I think it's warranted. He's just he's been pretty consistent there for the Jags. Higbee, again, that same game environment of Arizona Rams that we like quite a bit. Pitts is the one that I've been going back and forth on Pitts. I mentioned earlier that like I might play a little bit of Desmond Ridder just because I think that they have a shot at like putting up a big score, just some long touchdown passes against this Commanders defense. Pitts one of those guys that he's up at 7% ownership. He is 3,500, had his best game in a while last time out, but he also only played 53% of snaps last week. Like that was actually his lowest snap share of the season. He did run a good number of routes here on 25 routes, which was second on the team behind Drake London. But I might take some shots on Pitts. Hopefully he can build on that last game, but he's not somebody that I'm like, I don't have anywhere that really stands out to me that as somebody that I'm jamming that I'm going to be well over the field here this week.
And if you want another way to get exposure to Kyle Pitts this weekend, he actually is very, very low props at sportsbooks. It seems like the betting market has officially given up on Kyle Pitts, even though he was pretty decent last week. His over-under for receptions is 3.5 at Bet365. The over is plus 145. That is the best available line on Kyle Pitts. It's also one of the best available bets in Odd Shopper for this weekend. And if you guys are looking to sign up at Bet365, use the link below. They have a great deal going on now where you place a $5 bet after signing up, and they give you $150 in bonus bets. They're only available right now in Kentucky, Ohio, New Jersey, Virginia, Iowa, and Colorado. But if you're in one of those states and you haven't taken advantage of the Bet365 offer, now is a really good time to do it because we see these deals come and go pretty quickly, off without much notice. So take advantage of $150 for free. You're not going to get these offers very frequently in the betting world. If you're anybody you know has a gambling problem, call or text the number 1-800-GAMBLER. And for me, a tight end, Neil, I have just like a spray and pray at tight end. I have 3 tight ends that I have double-digit exposure to right now. It's Hawkinson, who's my most roster tight end. Then it's Higbee and Ertz, which is solely for stacking purposes. And then I just have a bunch of guys who it's like 4 to 5% of, including like Kyle Pitts, Laporta, Logan Thomas. it's a shit position. I don't have any like real strong takes other than if you have the salary, you pay up for Hawkinson because Justin Jefferson's out.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot, and that's something like I think Alex used to say all the time, like just include your tight end in your stack or like your game stack. I think like last week we took some stands last week. This week, really nobody is standing out to me as somebody that I'm going to be jamming into my lineups other than Hawkinson. I'll probably be over 9% Hawkinson, but yeah, it's going to be a lot of who makes sense in the game stack, and within that, it'll be a lot of Rams, Cardinals, Vikings, Bears for me. I think that those four tight ends I'm going to get a good amount of just because I'm playing those game stacks a good amount.
All right, so let's wrap up the show for the week, Neil. If you were playing one lineup in a large field tournament, what would be your stack? Who'd be the quarterback and the pass catchers you go to in that lineup?
I think I might have done Tua to Jalen Waddle the past 2 weeks, and I'm tempted to go right back there. Like that is once again going to be one of my favorite stacks. I feel like I should mix it up just for the sake of mixing things up, but and I'll do it. I'm going to choose a different stack just so that this is the week that Tua to Jalen Waddle can work out because I didn't choose them as my stack. So I'll choose a different stack here, and I'm going to go with. This is interesting. Oh man, this is tough. I'm going to go Kirk Cousins to TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison.
I mean, the one I have the most exposure to is Kupp to Stafford this weekend. The problem, though, is like the field is kind of getting there. So that's going to be my chalk one. But here's what I'll do to make it a little bit more contrarian. Double stack. Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, and Tyler Higbee. We're filling that tight end spot, which is very difficult to fill this weekend. Higbee is probably going to take a little bit of a step back the rest of the season in terms of targets, what we've seen in other years because Cooper Kupp is back in the mix, and Nakua has also been a guy who demands a lot of targets. But I do think we're going to see Higbee still be a frequent red zone target of Matthew Stafford this season. So I'm going to go Tyler Higbee, Cooper Kupp, Matthew Stafford. That's my stack of